The old farmhouse sat alone on the hill like a wounded animal waiting to die. Its white paint had turned gray from years of Kentucky rain and mountain mist. The windows stared down at the valley below with empty black eyes. 3 stories tall, it was built in the style rich folks liked back in the 1860s. But now in 1894 it looked tired and forgotten. Constance Grimsley stood at the kitchen window washing dishes in cold water. Her hands moved slowly as she watched the fog roll through the tobacco fields. She was 28 years old but looked older. Her auburn hair was pulled back tight and her green eyes held secrets that would make most people run away screaming. This was her 3rd marriage and she was already planning how it would end. The house had been in the Grimsley family for 40 years. Edgar had inherited it from his father, along with 200 acres of good farming land. The property stretched from the main road all the way back to the dark woods where Cherokee Indians once lived. Local people said those woods still held their spirits. Constance had grown up poor in a cabin down by the creek. Her mother died when she was 12 and her father drank himself to death 2 years later. She learned early that the only way to survive was to marry a man with money. But men always disappointed her in the end. Her first husband, Samuel, had been kind at the start. He was a store owner in town who promised her a good life. But after 6 months, he started hitting her when he drank too much whiskey. One night he hit her so hard she saw stars. When she touched his face to push him away, something strange happened. She could see inside his mind to the thing he feared most. Samuel was terrified of drowning ever since he almost died in the river as a boy. 3 days later, they found Samuel face down in his own well. The sheriff said he must have fallen while drawing water. But Constance knew better. She had somehow made his worst nightmare come true. Her second husband, Thomas, was a traveling preacher who owned land near Louisville. He seemed like a good Christian man until she discovered he was stealing money from the church collection plate. When she confronted him, he threatened to throw her out with nothing. That night she touched his hand during dinner and saw his deepest fear. Thomas was afraid of fire because his childhood home had burned down with his little sister inside. A week later, Thomas died when his lamp somehow fell over and set his bedroom on fire. Again, the sheriff called it an accident. But Constance was starting to understand she had a gift that most people would call evil. Now there was Edgar. She had met him at Thomas' funeral where he came to pay his respects. Edgar was 45 years old with graying hair and rough hands from farm work. He owned more land than anyone else in Harlan County and lived alone in the big house on the hill. He seemed lonely and ready for a wife to take care of him. At first, Edgar treated her well. He bought her new dresses and promised she would never want for anything. But like the others, he changed after a few months. The drinking started slowly, then got worse. Edgar would come home from town smelling like whiskey and looking for a fight. When he got angry, his hands turned into fists. Last week, she found his will hidden in his desk drawer. Edgar was leaving everything to his brother William, who lived in Louisville. After 3 marriages, Constance would still end up with nothing. That was when she decided Edgar had to join her other husbands in the ground. The house itself seemed to know what she was thinking. Strange things had been happening since she started planning Edgar's death. Doors would open by themselves, especially the door that led down to the cellar. Cold air would suddenly fill a room even on warm days. At night she heard footsteps in the hallway, but when she looked, no one was there. The cellar was where her gift worked best. It was the oldest part of the house built directly into the hillside. The walls were made of stone and the floor was packed dirt. In one corner stood an old wooden shelf that held glass jars and dried herbs left by the previous owners. Constance had added her own collection over the years. Things her Cherokee grandmother had taught her about before she died. Her grandmother had been the daughter of a Cherokee medicine woman. She knew about roots and herbs that could heal or harm. More importantly, she knew about the old ways of reaching into people's minds and finding their secret fears. She had taught some of these things to Constance when she was just a little girl, but grandmother always warned her that such power came with a price. The spirits of the dead did not like being disturbed. Use the gift too much and they might come looking for revenge. Constance did not believe in such warnings anymore. She had used her power twice and both times it worked perfectly. Samuel and Thomas were dead and she was still alive and free. Soon Edgar would join them, and she would finally inherit enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. As she finished the dishes, Constance heard Edgar's wagon coming up the road. He had been in town all day, probably drinking with his friends at the saloon. She dried her hands and prepared to greet him with a smile. Tonight she would begin the process that would end his life. But as Edgar stumbled through the front door, something felt different. His eyes looked wild and frightened. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if something had followed him home from town. Strange dreams had been visiting Constance lately. In these dreams, her dead husbands came to see her. Samuel would stand by her bed, dripping wet from the well water. Thomas appeared covered in burns from the fire that killed him. They never spoke, but their eyes held messages she did not want to understand. The people in town had started talking too. They whispered about the Grimsley curse and how men who married into the family always died young. Some of the older women crossed themselves when Constance walked by. They remembered her grandmother and the stories about Cherokee magic that could kill from a distance. Tonight Edgar looked like a man who had heard those stories. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at Constance with new eyes. Eyes that held suspicion and growing fear. This would make her work more difficult but not impossible. Fear would actually make her gift stronger. As darkness fell over the Kentucky hills, Constance Grimsley began planning the death of her third husband. In the cellar below, something old and angry stirred in response to her thoughts. The Cherokee spirits were waking up, and they did not approve of how their sacred knowledge was being used. The autumn wind picked up outside, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. It sounded almost like whispers calling out warnings that no one was listening to anymore. The next morning, Edgar sat at the breakfast table picking at his eggs. His hands shook as he lifted the coffee cup to his lips. Dark circles under his eyes showed he had not slept well. Constance watched him from across the table and smiled sweetly like a loving wife should. Edgar kept looking toward the cellar door. It had opened by itself 3 times during the night. Each time he got up to close it, but by morning it stood wide open again. The cold air that came up from below carried strange smells. Dirt and something else he could not name. Constance knew exactly what that smell was. It was the scent of old Cherokee magic mixed with death. Her grandmother had taught her to recognize it when she was just 7 years old. Back then she thought it was just another one of grandmother's strange stories. Now she knew better. The gift had first shown itself during her marriage to Samuel. She remembered that night clearly. Samuel came home drunk and angry about money. He grabbed her arm so hard it left bruises and shook her until her teeth rattled. Without thinking, she reached up and pressed her palm against his face. That was when it happened. Images flooded her mind like water bursting through a broken dam. She saw Samuel as a boy of 10 summers playing by the creek behind his family farm. His older brother dared him to swim across to the other side. But the spring rains had made the water deep and fast. Samuel jumped in and immediately got caught by the current. The water pulled him under and filled his lungs. He thrashed and fought but could not reach the surface. His brother ran for help, but it was too late. By the time the men pulled Samuel out, he was blue and still. They worked on him for an hour before he finally coughed up the muddy water and started breathing again. From that day forward, Samuel feared water more than anything else in the world. He would not even take baths in the big metal tub. He washed himself with a cloth and a small bowl of water. Rainstorms made him hide in the house with the curtains drawn tight. When Constance saw this memory, she felt something dark and hungry wake up inside her chest. The fear was like food to whatever lived in her blood. It grew stronger as it fed on Samuel's terror. That night she dreamed of drowning and woke up gasping for air. 3 days later, Samuel went out to the well to draw water for washing. Constance watched from the kitchen window as he lowered the bucket. Something made him lean too far over the stone edge. Maybe he saw his own reflection in the water below. Maybe he saw something else entirely. The neighbors found him the next morning floating face down with his arms spread wide. The sheriff said it must have been an accident, but Constance knew she had somehow pushed Samuel's old fear back into his mind with supernatural force. The Cherokee blood in her veins had awakened something that should have stayed sleeping. With Thomas, the process was different. By then, she understood what she could do and planned it more carefully. Thomas was stealing money from the church and using it to buy himself fine clothes and expensive whiskey. When she caught him counting the stolen coins, he threatened to beat her bloody. That night at dinner, she served him his favorite meal of fried chicken and cornbread. While he ate, she reached across the table and touched his hand as if she wanted to hold it. The moment their skin met, she was inside his memories. Thomas had been 12 years old when his family home caught fire during a winter storm. He woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of his little sister Mary crying in the next room. The wooden walls were already burning and the hallway was filled with thick black smoke that stung his eyes and throat. He tried to reach Mary, but the flames drove him back. His parents dragged him outside while the house burned like a giant torch against the snowy night. They could hear Mary screaming until the roof fell in. Then there was only silence and the sound of wood breaking apart in the heat. Thomas never got over watching his sister die in the fire. He could not stand the smell of wood smoke or the sight of open flames. Even lighting a lamp for reading made his hands shake. On cold nights when the fireplace was burning, he would sit as far away from it as possible. After touching his hand, Constance spent the next week feeding this fear. She left candles burning in rooms where Thomas would find them. She made sure the fireplace logs crackled extra loud. She even burned some papers in the yard where he could smell the smoke. Each day, Thomas grew more nervous and jumpy. He started drinking more whiskey to calm his nerves. One night he drank so much he could barely walk straight. When he went to bed, he knocked over the oil lamp on his nightstand. The burning oil spread across the wooden floor faster than he could move in his drunken state. By the time the neighbors saw the flames, it was too late. They found Thomas burned beyond recognition, still clutching the empty whiskey bottle. Another accident, according to the sheriff. But Constance knew she had reached into his mind and made his childhood nightmare come alive again. Now Edgar was showing the same signs. Fear was making him weak and careless. Last night she had touched his shoulder while bringing him coffee. The vision that came to her was perfect for her needs. Edgar had been working in a coal mine when he was 20 years old. His younger brother Jake worked beside him, digging black coal from deep in the mountain. One day the roof supports cracked and tons of rock came crashing down. Edgar managed to dive clear, but Jake was trapped underneath. It took them 6 hours to dig Jake out. By then he was dead with his eyes still open, staring at nothing. But the worst part was how small the space had been. Jake was pressed into a hole barely big enough for his body, buried alive in the dark with no room to move or breathe. Ever since then, Edgar could not stand being in small, closed spaces. He slept with the bedroom door open. He would not go into the root cellar or even the small closet under the stairs. The very idea of being trapped underground made him break out in cold sweats. This would be easier than the others. Fear of being buried alive was one of the strongest terrors a person could have. All she had to do was feed it carefully until Edgar made a fatal mistake. But as Constance planned her husband's death, she did not notice the shadows moving in the corners of the room. The Cherokee spirits were gathering strength, and they remembered every detail of the sacred knowledge being misused in their honor. Edgar had not slept properly in 5 days. Every night he heard sounds from inside the walls of the old house, scratching noises like fingernails on wood, footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, whispers in a language he did not understand but somehow made his blood run cold. The worst part was the mirrors. Every mirror in the house showed things that were not really there. This morning while shaving, Edgar looked into the small glass above the washstand and saw 2 men standing behind him. One was dripping wet with pondweeds in his hair. The other had burns covering half his face. When Edgar spun around to look, the men were gone. But he knew who they were. Samuel and Thomas. Constance's first 2 husbands. The men who died in accidents that were starting to seem less and less accidental. Constance watched Edgar growing more frightened each day and felt satisfaction warm her chest like good whiskey. Fear made her gift stronger. The more terrified Edgar became, the easier it would be to reach into his mind and twist his childhood nightmare until it killed him. But something else was happening in the house that Constance had not expected. The Cherokee spirits were getting restless. Her grandmother had always warned her that the old magic came with a price. Use it too often and the ancestors would take notice. They did not approve of their sacred knowledge being turned toward murder. The cellar had become the center of the supernatural storm growing inside the farmhouse. The stone walls seemed to pulse with invisible energy. The packed dirt floor stayed cold, even on hot autumn days. Strange symbols had started appearing carved into the wooden shelves where Constance kept her herbs and roots. These were Cherokee markings that her grandmother had taught her to recognize. They were warnings telling her to stop before it was too late. But Constance had come too far to quit now. Edgar had to die so she could finally have the security she had always wanted. At dinner, Edgar barely touched his food. He kept glancing toward the cellar door, which had been opening by itself more frequently. Sometimes it would bang shut so hard the whole house shook. Other times it would creak open slowly like an invisible hand was turning the handle. Edgar had also started talking about leaving the farm and moving to Louisville to live with his brother William. This worried Constance because her power seemed tied to the house and the land. If Edgar left before she could complete her work, she might never get another chance to inherit his money. That night, Constance decided to speed up the process. She waited until Edgar was sitting by the fireplace drinking whiskey and trying to calm his nerves. Then she brought him a fresh glass and made sure her fingers touched his when she handed it to him. The moment their skin met, she pushed deeper into his mind than she had ever gone before. She found the memory of his brother Jake's death and wrapped her supernatural will around it like fingers around a throat. Then she squeezed hard and felt Edgar gasp as the vision hit him with the force of a physical blow. Jake had been only 18 when the mine roof collapsed. Edgar remembered every detail with painful clarity. The sound of cracking wood supports, the rumble of falling rock, the cloud of coal dust that filled the air and made it impossible to see or breathe. Jake screamed for help as the rocks pinned his legs. But more stone kept falling and soon he was buried up to his chest. The space around him got smaller and smaller until he could barely move his arms. Edgar tried to dig him out with his bare hands, but there was too much weight holding his brother down. The rescue crew worked for hours while Jake called out from under the rocks. His voice got weaker as time passed. Near the end, he was whispering about how dark it was and how he could not feel his legs anymore. Then the voice stopped, and they knew Jake was gone. When they finally moved enough rocks to see him, Jake looked like he was sleeping, but his eyes were wide open, staring up at nothing. His mouth was full of coal dust and his fingernails were broken from trying to claw his way out of the grave that had fallen on top of him. As Constance fed this memory back to Edgar with supernatural force, she felt something push back against her mind. The Cherokee spirits were trying to protect him. They sent waves of cold air through the room that made the fire flicker and nearly go out. The windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere in the walls something large seemed to be moving around. Edgar dropped his whiskey glass and it shattered on the stone hearth. He clutched his chest and bent over double as if he was having trouble breathing. Sweat poured down his face even though the room had turned ice cold. For a moment, Constance thought he might die right there in his chair. But then Edgar straightened up and looked directly at her with eyes that held a terrible new understanding. He knew what she was doing to him. Somehow he had felt her inside his mind, pushing the nightmare deeper into his thoughts. Edgar stood up slowly and backed toward the door. He never took his eyes off Constance, as if she was a dangerous animal that might attack if he looked away. When he reached the hallway, he turned and ran upstairs to his bedroom. She heard him slam the door and drag furniture in front of it. This was not how it was supposed to work. Samuel and Thomas had never realized what was happening to them. They just got more and more afraid until their own terror killed them. But Edgar was fighting back somehow. Maybe the Cherokee spirits were giving him strength to resist her power. Constance went down to the cellar to think about what to do next. The stone walls felt warm to the touch now, and the carved symbols were glowing with a faint blue light. As she stood in the darkness, she heard voices speaking in the Cherokee language her grandmother had taught her years ago. They were telling her to stop, to leave Edgar alone and find another way to live. But Constance had killed 2 men already, and she would not give up now. If Edgar wanted to fight her gift, then she would have to use more power, enough to break through whatever protection the spirits were trying to give him. Upstairs, Edgar sat on his bed with a loaded shotgun across his knees. He could hear Constance moving around in the cellar directly below his room. Strange lights flickered under his door, and the smell of burning sage drifted up through the floorboards. Whatever his wife was doing down there, it was not natural. Edgar had lived in this house his whole life and never seen anything like what was happening now. The very walls seemed alive and angry. Something evil had taken root in his home, and it wore the face of the woman he had married. The blood moon rose over Kentucky on Halloween night, casting everything in deep red light. Constance stood in the cellar surrounded by candles and bundles of dried herbs. Tonight she would finish what she started. Edgar would die whether the Cherokee spirits approved or not. For 3 days she had fasted and prepared for the final ritual. Her grandmother had taught her that blood moon nights held the most power for Cherokee magic. The barrier between the living world and the spirit world became thin enough to cross. But crossing it was dangerous for both the living and the dead. Constance had gathered everything she needed. Personal items from each of her dead husbands lay arranged in a circle on the dirt floor. Samuel's pocket watch still ticked, though it should have stopped working long ago. Thomas' wedding ring was blackened as if it had been in a fire. In the center sat an old mirror that belonged to her great-grandmother who had been full Cherokee. The mirror was made of polished silver that reflected things ordinary mirrors could not show. Tonight it would help her reach deep enough into Edgar's mind to plant his death there like a poison seed. But first, she had to deal with the spirits who were trying to protect him. Upstairs, Edgar paced back and forth in his bedroom with the shotgun in his hands. He had not slept or eaten for 2 days. Every shadow seemed to move when he was not looking directly at it. The walls themselves whispered warnings in voices that sounded like his dead brother Jake. The house shook as if something huge was moving through it. Picture frames fell off the walls and crashed to the floor. The temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on the windows even though it was still October. Edgar could see his breath in white puffs as he tried to stay warm. Down in the cellar, Constance began the ritual her grandmother had taught her. She spoke the old Cherokee words while walking in a circle around the personal items. With each step, the candle flames grew taller and brighter. The carved symbols on the stone walls started glowing with blue fire that gave off no heat. But something was wrong. The Cherokee ancestors were fighting back harder than ever before. Cold wind howled through the cellar even though there were no windows or doors open. The herbs scattered across the floor as if invisible hands were trying to stop the ritual from continuing. A voice spoke from the silver mirror. It was Constance's grandmother warning her in the Cherokee language to stop before it was too late. The ancestors were angry that their sacred knowledge was being used for murder. If she continued, they would turn their power against her instead of helping her. Constance ignored the warnings and kept chanting. She had come too far to quit now. Edgar had money and land that should be hers. She deserved to live in comfort after all the suffering she had endured from worthless men who promised everything and delivered nothing but pain. The ritual reached its peak as the blood moon climbed directly overhead. Constance picked up the silver mirror and stared into its surface. Instead of her own reflection, she saw Edgar cowering in his bedroom. Through the supernatural connection, she reached out with her mind to touch his thoughts. But Edgar was ready for her this time. The Cherokee spirits had been teaching him how to protect himself. When Constance tried to push the nightmare of his brother Jake into his mind, Edgar pushed back with his own will. For the first time in her life, Constance met resistance that she could not break through. The supernatural battle raged through the old farmhouse. Windows exploded outward, showering the yard with broken glass. The wooden floors buckled and cracked as if the house was tearing itself apart. In the cellar, stones fell from the ceiling as the very foundation shook. Constance's chanting grew louder and more desperate. She poured all her power into breaking through Edgar's mental defenses. But with each attack, the Cherokee spirit sent more energy to help him resist. The ritual was backfiring in ways her grandmother had warned about, but Constance had never believed possible. Edgar felt the moment when Constance's power finally broke against his protected mind. The fear she had been feeding him for weeks suddenly snapped back like a rubber band pulled too tight. All the terror and nightmare visions she had planted in his thoughts returned to her magnified 100 times over. Constance screamed as her own power turned against her. Every fear she had ever used to kill came flooding into her mind at once. She saw herself drowning like Samuel with water filling her lungs. She felt flames burning her skin like Thomas trapped in a house fire. Most terrible of all, she experienced being buried alive like Edgar's brother Jake, crushed under tons of rock with no room to move or breathe. But these were not just visions. The Cherokee spirits were making her feel every death she had caused as if it was happening to her own body. The supernatural feedback was so intense that Constance's heart began beating irregularly. Her hair turned white from shock, and her green eyes stared at horrors only she could see. Edgar heard her screams and slowly made his way downstairs. He found Constance lying on the cellar floor surrounded by scattered candles and burned herbs. She was alive but barely conscious. Her lips moved as if she was trying to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes stared at the ceiling but saw something far more terrible than the stone walls above. The Cherokee spirits had trapped Constance in a waking nightmare, where she would experience the deaths of her victims over and over again. She had used their sacred power for evil, and now she would pay the price for as long as her body could survive the endless torment. Edgar gathered his few belongings and left the farmhouse that same night. He never looked back at the woman who had tried to murder him with supernatural fear. Behind him, the house stood silent and dark, except for strange lights that flickered in the cellar windows. Constance Grimsley had become a prisoner of the very spirits she had tried to command. The blood moon set as Edgar walked down the hill toward town. He would never speak of what happened in the old farmhouse. Some secrets were too dangerous to tell, and some evil was too dark for ordinary people to understand. Edgar made it to town just as the sun was coming up on November 1st. He went straight to the sheriff and told him that his wife Constance had suffered some kind of breakdown and needed help. But Edgar did not mention the supernatural events or the Cherokee spirits. No one would believe such a story anyway. Sheriff Morgan rode out to the Grimsley farm with Edgar and the town doctor. They found Constance exactly where Edgar had left her, lying on the cellar floor. She was alive but completely unresponsive. Her white hair was spread around her head like a halo, and her green eyes stared at nothing. When the doctor tried to examine her, she did not react to his touch or voice. The strangest thing was her expression. Most people who suffered mental breakdowns looked confused or frightened. But Constance looked like she was seeing something horrible that never stopped happening. Her face was frozen in permanent terror, as if she was trapped inside her worst nightmare with no way to wake up. They moved Constance to a room above the doctor's office in town. For weeks, people came to stare at the woman who had buried 3 husbands and finally lost her mind. She never spoke or moved on her own. The doctor had to feed her with a spoon like she was a baby. At night, she would make small whimpering sounds, but her eyes never closed in sleep. Edgar sold the farm to his brother William for half what it was worth. He wanted to get away from Harlan County as quickly as possible. The memories of that Halloween night followed him wherever he went. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of Samuel and Thomas in store windows or on crowded streets. The ghosts seemed to be thanking him for stopping their killer. But Edgar was forever changed by his experience with Constance's supernatural power. Before meeting her, he had been a practical man who believed only in things he could see and touch. Now he knew there were forces in the world that science could not explain. Dark magic was real, and it could kill people as surely as a gun or a knife. Edgar moved to Louisville and found work in a tobacco warehouse. He lived alone in a small apartment and rarely spoke to his neighbors. The few friends he made noticed that he seemed nervous around mirrors and would not enter small enclosed spaces. He never married again because he was afraid another woman might have the same terrible gift that Constance possessed. Meanwhile, the old Grimsley farmhouse stood empty on the hill. William tried to find tenants, but no one would live there for long. Strange things happened to anyone who spent the night in the house. Doors opened and closed by themselves. Cold spots appeared in random rooms. Most disturbing of all, people reported seeing a woman in a white nightgown walking through the halls carrying candles. The cellar was the worst part of the house. Even in daylight, it felt dangerous to go down there. The stone walls stayed cold and damp no matter what the weather was like outside. Sometimes people heard a woman's voice chanting in a foreign language that sounded like Cherokee, but when they looked, no one was there except shadows moving in the candlelight. Local Cherokee elders came to examine the farmhouse after hearing stories about what Constance had done. They found the carved symbols on the cellar walls and recognized them as warnings from the ancestors. The spirits were angry that their sacred knowledge had been twisted into a tool for murder. They would not rest until the evil was contained. The Cherokee performed their own ritual to seal the supernatural energy inside the cellar. They burned sage and tobacco while speaking prayers in their ancient language. For a while, the strange activity in the house seemed to quiet down, but everyone knew it was still there, waiting just beneath the surface. 3 months after Halloween, a traveling preacher came through Harlan County. He had heard about Constance and wanted to visit her to offer prayers for her recovery. But when he arrived at the doctor's office, he found that Constance was gone. She had vanished from her locked room sometime during the night, leaving no trace behind. Some people thought she had wandered off into the mountains and died from exposure. Others believed family members had taken her away to care for her in private. But Edgar knew the truth when he heard about her disappearance. The Cherokee spirits had finally claimed her completely. She was no longer trapped in a human body, but had become something else entirely. Reports began coming in from all over eastern Kentucky about a ghostly woman who appeared to people in remote areas. She would show up at isolated cabins or along mountain trails, always wearing a white nightgown with long white hair flowing around her shoulders. Her green eyes glowed with supernatural light, and anyone who looked directly at her would be overcome with terror. The ghost seemed to be searching for something or someone. Local people started calling her the White Woman of the Hills. Parents warned their children to stay close to home after dark because the White Woman might be looking for new victims to replace the husbands she could no longer kill. Edgar heard these stories and knew they were true. Constance had become the very thing she had once used to frighten others. The Cherokee spirits had turned her into a creature of pure fear, doomed to wander the mountains forever. She was no longer human, but had become a living nightmare that could never find rest or peace. As winter settled over Kentucky, Edgar tried to forget about his dead wife and the supernatural battle they had fought in the old farmhouse. But late at night, when the wind howled through the city streets, he sometimes thought he could hear a woman's voice chanting Cherokee words in the darkness. The White Woman was still out there somewhere, and she might be looking for the one person who had escaped her deadly power. Edgar kept a gun by his bed and made sure all his doors and windows were locked tight. He had survived Constance's supernatural attacks once, but he did not know if he would be strong enough to face her ghostly form. Some battles with evil could only be won once, and Edgar prayed he would never have to fight that war again. Edgar lived for 29 more years after escaping from Constance and her deadly supernatural power. He died in 1923 at the age of 74, still haunted by memories of that terrible Halloween night. But before he passed away, Edgar wrote down everything that had happened in a leather-bound journal. He wanted people to know the truth about the Grimsley farmhouse and the evil that had lived there. The journal stayed hidden in Edgar's apartment until his landlord found it, while cleaning out his belongings. Most people who read the story thought Edgar had suffered from some kind of mental illness brought on by his wife's breakdown, but a few believers kept the journal safe and passed it down through their families. The old Grimsley farmhouse still stands on its hill overlooking the Kentucky Valley. Over the years, different families have tried to live there, but none stayed for more than a few months. The supernatural activity never completely stopped, despite the Cherokee rituals meant to contain it. People still report seeing strange lights in the cellar windows and hearing a woman's voice chanting in the Cherokee language. Modern paranormal investigators have visited the property many times since it became famous through Edgar's journal. They bring electronic equipment to measure temperature changes and record unexplained sounds. Most of them capture evidence of supernatural activity, but few stay long enough to complete their studies. There is something about the farmhouse that makes even experienced ghost hunters nervous. The cellar remains the most active part of the house. Digital voice recorders pick up whispered Cherokee words and the sound of a woman crying. Video cameras sometimes capture shadowy figures moving between the stone walls. Most disturbing of all, investigators report feeling watched by invisible eyes that follow them wherever they go in the underground room. Local Cherokee elders still come to check on the farmhouse from time to time. They can sense that the angry spirits are still there waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb their rest. The tribal council has asked the current property owner to let them perform a more complete cleansing ritual. But legal complications and insurance problems have prevented any major supernatural intervention. The White Woman of the Hills continued to be seen throughout eastern Kentucky for decades after Constance's disappearance. Dozens of people reported encounters with a ghostly figure in a white nightgown who appeared along mountain roads or near isolated homes. Most witnesses described the same glowing green eyes and long white hair that Edgar remembered from his final confrontation with his murderous wife. But sightings of the White Woman became less frequent as years passed. Some Cherokee medicine people believe that Constance's spirit eventually found a way to move on to whatever waits beyond death. Others think she simply learned to hide better and is still wandering the mountains looking for victims to terrify. In recent years, new strange events have been reported in Harlan County that might be connected to the old Grimsley case. 3 different women have disappeared under mysterious circumstances since 1990. All 3 were married to wealthy older men who later died in what appeared to be accidents. The local sheriff has investigated each case but found no evidence of foul play. But people who knew Edgar Grimsley's story noticed disturbing similarities. Each of the dead men had suffered from severe anxiety and bad dreams before their deaths. All three died from causes related to their deepest childhood fears: heart attacks during thunderstorms, drowning in shallow water, suffocation from unknown causes. The missing women all had some Cherokee ancestry and had lived near the old Grimsley property at some point in their lives. Investigators wonder if they might have discovered Constance's methods and decided to use them for their own purposes. Or perhaps the evil spirits in the farmhouse cellar found new human vessels to carry on their supernatural murders. Modern paranormal researchers have tried to contact Constance's ghost using electronic voice phenomena and digital recording equipment. Sometimes they get responses in the form of Cherokee words or angry whispers. But the spirit that answers their questions does not seem to be entirely human anymore. Whatever Constance became after her final ritual, it has been changed by decades of supernatural existence. The Cherokee Nation has officially requested that the Grimsley farmhouse be declared a sacred site that should not be disturbed by curiosity seekers or paranormal investigators. Tribal historians say the property sits on ground that was once used for important spiritual ceremonies. The ancestors are still protecting the land from those who would misuse their sacred knowledge. But the farmhouse continues to attract people drawn by Edgar Grimsley's journal and the promise of encountering real supernatural activity. YouTube channels devoted to paranormal investigation have made the property famous around the world. Hundreds of people visit every year hoping to capture evidence of ghosts or communicate with the spirits of the dead. Most visitors leave disappointed after experiencing nothing more unusual than cold drafts and creaking floors. But a few sensitive individuals report much more intense encounters. They describe feeling watched by invisible eyes and hearing Cherokee chanting that seems to come from deep underground. Some claim to have seen Constance herself still performing her deadly rituals in the cellar. The current owner of the Grimsley property has installed security cameras and motion detectors to keep trespassers away. But the electronic equipment often malfunctions for no apparent reason. Cameras stop working when pointed at the cellar door. Motion sensors trigger randomly, as if detecting movement from invisible intruders. Edgar Grimsley's journal has been digitized and is now available online for anyone interested in reading his account of supernatural murder and Cherokee spirit magic gone wrong. Scholars debate whether his story represents genuine paranormal activity or elaborate delusion brought on by psychological trauma. But the journal continues to inspire new investigations into the connection between ancient spiritual practices and modern supernatural phenomena. The Grimsley case remains one of the most well-documented examples of supernatural murder in American history. Whether people believe in Cherokee magic or not, most agree that something terrible happened in that old farmhouse during the autumn of 1894. Edgar Grimsley survived to tell his story, but Constance paid the ultimate price for misusing power that was never meant for killing. The legacy of the Kentucky widow lives on in the abandoned farmhouse that still stands guard over its dark secrets. Somewhere in the shadows between life and death, Constance Grimsley may still be searching for victims to feed her supernatural hunger for fear and death.